On this day in history, July 1st, 1569, as part of the Union of Lublin, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania confirm a real union. The united country is called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or the Republic of Both Nations. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Lublin, a town of Poland, capital of the province of the same name, 109 miles by rail southeast of Warsaw, on a small tributary of the Vepris. Population 1931, 112,522. Estimated from 1939, 122,000. It is one of the centers of the manufacture of thread yarn, linen and hempen goods, and woolen stuffs. There is also trade in grain and cattle. It has an old citadel, a university, several palaces of Polish nobles, and many interesting churches, and is the see of a Roman Catholic bishop. The cathedral dates from the 16th century. Of the former fortifications, nothing remains except the four gates, one dating from 1342. Lublin was in existence in the 10th century, and has a church which is said to have been built in 986. During the time the Jagiellon dynasty ruled over Lithuania and Poland, it was the most important city between the Vistula and the Dnieper, having 40,000 inhabitants, 70,000 according to other authorities, and all the trade with Podolia, Volhynia, and Red Russia. Indeed, the present town is surrounded with ruins, which prove that it formerly covered a much larger area, but it was frequently destroyed by the Tartars, i.e. 1240, and the Cossacks, i.e. 1477. In 1568-69, the Union of Poland and Lithuania was decided there. In 1702, another convention was held in Lublin, in favor of Augustus II and against Charles XII of Sweden, who carried the town by assault. In 1831, Lublin was taken by the Russians. Returned to Poland in 1918, it was taken by Germany in 1939. On this day in history, July 2nd, 1644, as part of the English Civil War, the Battle of Marston Moor. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. The Battle of Marston Moor was fought on July 2nd, 1644, on a moor, now enclosed, 7 miles west of York, between the Royalist army under Prince Rupert and the Parliamentary and Scottish armies under the Earl of Manchester, Lord Fairfax, and Lord Leven. Rupert had relieved York and joined forces with the Marquess of Newcastle's army that had defended that city, and the Parliamentarians and Scots who had besieged it had drawn off southwestward, followed by the Royalists. On the morning of July 2nd, however, Rupert's attack on the rearguard forced them to halt and deploy on rising ground on the south edge of the moor, their position being defined on the right and left by Long Marston and Tockwith, and divided from the Royalist army on the moor by a lane connecting these two villages. The respective forces were Royalists about 18,000, Parliamentarians and Scots about 27,000. The armies stood front to front. On the Royalist right was half the cavalry under Rupert. The infantry was in the center in two lines, and the left wing of cavalry was under General Lord Goring. The lane along the front was held by skirmishers. On the other side, the cavalry of the Eastern Association under Lieutenant General Cromwell and that of the Scots under Major General Leslie formed the left. The infantry of the Eastern Association under Major General Crawford, of the Scots under Lord Leven, and of the Yorkshire Parliamentarians under Lord Fairfax was in the centre, and the Yorkshire Cavalry under Sir Thomas Fairfax was on the right wing. During the afternoon there was a desultory cannonade, but neither side advanced. At last, concluding from movements in the enemy's lines that there would be no fighting that day, Rupert and Newcastle strolled away to their coaches, and their soldiers dismounted and lay down to rest. But seeing this, Cromwell instantly advanced his wing to the attack. 5 p.m. His dragoons drove away the skirmishers along the lane, and the line cavalry crossed into the moor. The general forward movement spread along the parliamentary line from left to right, the Eastern Association infantry being the first to cross the road. In Rupert's momentary absence, the surprised Royalist cavalry could make no head against Cromwell's charge, although the latter was only made piecemeal as each unit crossed the lane and formed to the front. Rupert soon galloped up with his fresh second line and drove back Cromwell's men. Cromwell himself being wounded, but Leslie and the Scots cavalry, taking ground to their left, swung in upon Rupert's flank, and after a hard struggle, the hitherto unconquered cavalry of the prince was broken and routed. Then, being unlike other cavalry of the time, a thoroughly disciplined force, the Eastern Association cavalry rallied, leaving the pursuit to the Scots' light horse. On the parliamentary right, Goring had swept away the Yorkshire horse, and although most of his troopers had followed in disorderly pursuit, Sir Charles Lucas with some squadrons was attacking the exposed right of Leven's infantry. At the same time, the parliamentary infantry had mostly crossed the lane and was fighting at close quarters and suffering severely. Newcastle's North Country Whitecoat Brigade driving back and finally penetrating their centre. Lord Leven gave up the battle as lost and rode away to Tadcaster. But the Scots on the right of the foot held firm against Lucas's attacks, and Cromwell and Leslie, with their cavalry, passed along the rear of the royal army, guided by Sir Thomas Fairfax, who, though wounded in the rout of his Yorkshire horse, had made his way to the other flank. Then on the ground where Goring had routed Fairfax, Cromwell and Leslie won an easy victory over Goring's scattered and disordered horsemen. The Eastern Association infantry had followed the horse and was now in rear of the Royalists. The original parliamentary centre of foot, a remnant, but one containing only the bravest and steadiest men, held fast, and soon the Royalist infantry was broken up into isolated regiments and surrounded by the victorious horse and foot of the enemy. The Whitecoats retreated into an enclosure and there defended themselves to the last man. The rest were cut down on the field or scattered in the pursuit, and at nightfall the Royalist army had ceased to exist. Some of Rupert's foot regiments made their way to York, but the dispirited garrison only held out for a fortnight. Rupert rallied some 6,000 of the men and escaped over the hills into Lancashire, thence rejoining King Charles in the south, but the northern army, the main hope of the Royalist cause, was destroyed. On this day in history, July 3rd, 1608, Quebec City is founded by Samuel de Champlain. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the early history of the city. The first known white man to visit Quebec was Jacques Cartier, the French navigator, in 1535, who found on a site a large Indian village called Stadonaka. In July 1608, the present city was founded and named by Champlain. Its growth was slow, and in 1629 it had but 2 permanently settled families, with a shifting population of monks, officials, and fur traders. In that year, it was captured by the English under Sir David Kirke, 1597 to 1656. But in 1632, it was restored to the French by the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. In 1663, the colony of New France was created a royal province, and Quebec became the capital. In 1690, Sir William Phips, governor of Massachusetts, attempted to reconquer it with a fleet and army fitted out by New England, but was defeated by the French governor, Frontenac. In 1711, a great British expedition sent against it under Sir Hovenden Walker was shipwrecked in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and the French held possession till 1759, when it was captured by the British troops on the 18th of September, 5 days after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. It was finally ceded to Great Britain by the Treaty of Paris in 1763. In 1775, the American generals Montgomery and Benedict Arnold attacked the city, but Montgomery was killed December 31st, 1775, and Arnold was compelled to retreat in the following spring. From 1763 till 1791, Quebec was the capital of the province of Quebec, as then existing. From 1791 till 1841, the capital of Lower Canada. From 1851 to 55, and from 1895 to 65, the capital of the United Province of Canada, and since 1867, the capital of the province of Quebec as part of the Dominion. On this day in history, July 4th, 1744, the Treaty of Lancaster, in which the Iroquois ceded lands between the Allegheny Mountains and the Ohio River to the British colonies, was signed in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Lancaster, a city of southeastern Pennsylvania, USA, on the Conestoga River, 65 miles west of Philadelphia, the county seat of Lancaster County. It is on the Lincoln Highway and several other federal and state roads, and is served by the Pennsylvania and Reading Railways, and by trolley and bus lines radiating in every direction. The population was 59,949 in 1930 and 61,345 in 1940. The city has an area of 3.9 square miles and a general elevation of 375 feet, and is set in a beautiful country. Lancaster County is one of the most highly cultivated districts in the United States and ranks first among all the counties in the value of its farm products per acre. In 1939, the aggregate value of the agricultural products was $13,174,740, and they included 33,976,800 pounds of tobacco, 5,295,540 bushels of corn, 2,021,400 bushels of wheat, 30,722,320 gallons of milk, and 14,956,320 dozens of eggs. The stockyards, one of the largest cattle markets east of Chicago, handled in 1939 animals representing a value of $23,452,156. Chief among the city's manufactures are linoleum, cork, watches, cigars, coffee, candy, cotton, and silk goods, and metal products. The aggregate factory output in 1937 was $42,398,917. Hydroelectric power is supplied by an immense plant on the Susquehanna River at Holtwood, 25 miles south. There are 142 wholesale houses and over 1,300 retail establishments in the city, which have transactions amounting annually to about $25 million and $36 million, respectively. Bank debits in 1940 totaled $310,309,394. The assessed valuation of property in 1941 was $90,401,150. Lancaster is the seat of the Theological Seminary of the Reformed Church, opened in Carlisle in 1825 and moved here in 1871, after some years in York and in Mercersburg. Of Franklin and Marshall College, Reformed Church, formed in 1852 by the Union of Franklin College, founded at Lancaster in 1787, and Marshall College, established at Mercersburg in 1836, and of the Thaddeus Stevens Trade School, established by bequest of Thaddeus Stevens, who lived here after 1842, and now a state institution. At Millersville, 4 miles southwest, is a state normal school. At Lelita, 8 miles north, is Linden Hall Seminary, established by the early Moravian settlers, one of the oldest schools for girls in the country. There are many buildings and spots with historic associations in and near the city, including Wheatland, the home of President Buchanan, Trinity Lutheran Church, built in 1736 and rebuilt in 1785, the Landis Valley Museum, with an interesting collection of 200,000 rare Pennsylvania Dutch articles, the Christian Hare House, built in 1719, the oldest house in the county, the tombs of Buchanan, Stevens, Thomas Mifflin, first governor of Pennsylvania, General John F. Reynolds, who fell at Gettysburg, and George Ross, signer of the Declaration of Independence. Ephrata Cloisters, at Ephrata, 14 miles northeast, built by the Seventh-day Adventists in the 18th century and used as a hospital during the Revolution, the quaint town of Mannheim, 10 miles north, where Baron Siegel made his famous iron and glass, and the Cornwall mines, 15 miles further on, from which he got ore for the cannon for Washington's army, and 22 miles south, the birthplace of Robert Fulton, inventor of the steamboat. Lancaster County was settled early in the 18th century by English Quakers and Episcopalians, Scottish and Irish Presbyterians, Welsh Dissenters, German Lutherans, Brethren, Dunkards, Mennonites, and Amish. Some of the sects still keep their distinctive customs and costumes, and on market days add a picturesque note to the city streets. Lancaster was settled about 1717, laid out in 1730, incorporated as a borough in 1742, and chartered as a city in 1818. During the colonial period, it was the largest inland city on the continent. An important treaty with the Iroquois Indians was negotiated here in June 1744, and here in 1780 some of General Burgoyne's troops were confined after the surrender at Saratoga. Lancaster was the national capital for one day, when the Continental Congress, driven from Philadelphia, sat here on September 27, 1777, and it was one of the places seriously considered when the choice of a permanent seat for the federal government was made. From 1799 to 1812, it was the capital of Pennsylvania. On this day in history, July 5, 1709, Etienne de Silhouette, French translator and politician, Controller General of Finances, is born. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the controller. Etienne de Silhouette, born 1709, died 1767, Controller General of France, was born at Limoges on July 5, 1709. He traveled extensively while still a young man and attracted attention by English translations, historical writings, and studies on the financial system of England. Successfully counselor to the Parliament of Metz, secretary to the Duke of Orleans, member of the Commission on Delimitation of Franco-British Interests in Arcadia, 1749, and Royal Commissioner in the Indies Company, he was named Controller General through the influence of the Marquis de Pompadour on March 4, 1759. The court at first reposed a blind confidence in him, but when he proposed a land tax on the estates of the nobles and the reduction of pensions, a storm of opposition broke on the unfortunate minister. In allusion to the sacrifices which he demanded of the nobles, even the conversion of their table plate into money, silhouette became the popular word for a figure reduced to simplest forms. Silhouette was driven from office in 1759 and withdrew to Brière-sur-Marne. He died on January 20th, 1767. On this day in history, July 6th, 1415, Jan Hus is condemned by the Assembly of the Council in Constance Cathedral as a heretic and sentenced to be burned at the stake. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the trial and death of Jan Hus. In 1413, his presence was requested at the Council of Constance, and, having arrived there on November 3rd, he received the famous imperial safe conduct, the promise of which he had been one of the inducements to quit the comparative security he had enjoyed in Bohemia. This safe conduct stated that, whatever judgment might be passed on him, Huss should be allowed to return freely to Bohemia. This by no means provided for his immunity from punishment. If faith to him had not been broken, he would have been sent back to Bohemia to be punished by his sovereign, the King of Bohemia. The treachery of King Sigismund is undeniable and was indeed admitted by the king himself. The safe conduct was probably indeed given by him to entice Huss to Constance. On December 4th, the Pope appointed a commission of 3 bishops to investigate the case against the heretic, and to procure witnesses, but the flight of Pope John XXIII in the following March furnished a pretext for the removal of Huss from the Dominican convent to a more secure place of confinement under the charge of the Bishop of Constance at Gottlieben on the Rhine. On May 4th, the temper of the council was revealed in its unanimous condemnation of Wycliffe, especially of the so-called 45 Articles, as erroneous, heretical, revolutionary. On June 5th, when the case of Huss came up for hearing, he was unable to make his defense by reason of the violent outcries. The sitting on June 7th, at which King Sigismund was present, was better disciplined. Propositions extracted from the De Ecclesia were brought up, and the relations between Wycliffe and Huss were discussed. The accused repudiated the charge of having abandoned the doctrine of transubstantiation. while expressing admiration for Wycliffe. On June 8th, he declared that among the propositions he could abjure was that relating to transubstantiation. Among those he felt constrained to maintain was that which denied that Peter was the head of the Church. The council finally demanded that Huss should declare that he had erred in all the articles cited against him. Secondly, that he should promise on oath neither to hold nor teach them in the future. Thirdly, that he should publicly recant them. He declined, and sentence of death was pronounced on July 6th, in the presence of Sigismund and a full sitting of the council. Once again he attempted to remonstrate, but in vain, and finally he betook himself to silent prayer. He was handed over to the secular arm, and on the same day the fire was kindled, and his voice, as it audibly prayed in the words of the Kyrie eleison, was soon stifled in the smoke. When the flames had done their office, the ashes that were left, and even the soil on which they lay, were carefully removed and thrown into the Rhine. Not many words are needed to convey a tolerably adequate estimate of the character and work of the pale, thin man in mean attire, who in sickness and poverty thus completed the 46th year of a busy life at the stake. The value of Huss as a scholar was formerly underrated. The publication of his Super Fourth Centenarium has proved that he was a man of real learning. Yet his principal glory will always be founded on his spiritual teaching. It is not easy to formulate precisely the beliefs for which he died, and certainly some of them, e.g., that regarding the Church, were such as many Protestants would regard as unguarded and difficult to harmonize with the maintenance of external church order. By propagating the reformatory doctrines of Wycliffe, Huss may be said to have handed on to Luther the torch which kindled the Reformation. His popularity in his own country was due both to his oratorical powers and to his pastoral activity. On this day in history, July 7th, 1807, the first Treaty of Tilsit between France and Russia is signed, ending hostilities between the two countries in the War of the Fourth Coalition. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Tilsit, a town in the Prussian province of East Prussia, Germany, on the left bank of the Memel or Niemen, 57 miles southeast of Memel and 72 northeast of Königsberg by rail. Population from 1939, 57,745. Tilsit, which received civic rights in 1552, grew up around a castle of the Teutonic Order, known as the Challoner House, founded in 1288. It owes most of its interest to the peace signed here in July 1807, the preliminaries of which were settled by the Emperors Alexander and Napoleon on a raft moored in the Memel. This treaty, which constituted the Kingdom of Westphalia and the Duchy of Warsaw, registers the nadir of Prussia's humiliation. On this day in history, July 8th, 1859, King Charles V and IV accedes to the throne of Sweden-Norway. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the king, and featuring narration from my friend, Adam.
Charles XV, born 1826, died 1872, King of Sweden and Norway, eldest son of Oscar I, King of Sweden and Norway, and Josephine Björnius of Luttenberg, was born on May 3, 1826. On June 19, 1850, he married Louisa, daughter of Prince Frederick of the Netherlands. He became regent on September 25, 1857, and king on the death of his father, July 8, 1859. His reign was remarkable for its manifold and far-reaching reforms. Sweden's existing communal law, 1862, ecclesiastical law, 1863, and criminal law, 1864, were enacted. Charles V also materially assisted de Geer to carry through his memorable reform of the Diet of 1865. Charles was a warm advocate of pan-Scandinavianism and the political solidarity of the three northern kingdoms, and his enthusiasm led him to give half promises of help to Denmark on the eve of the War of 1864. In view, however, of the unpreparedness of the Swedish army and the absence of support from any powers, Charles was forced to observe strict neutrality. He died at Malmo on September 18th, 1872. Charles V enjoyed the usual degree of popularity in both his kingdoms. He was an amateur painter, and his dicter showed him to have been a true poet. He left one child, a daughter, Louisa Josefina Eugenia, who in 1869 married the Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark.
On this day in history, July 9th, 381, the end of the first council of Christian bishops convened in Constantinople by the Roman Emperor Theodosius I. Included the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the First Council of Constantinople. The Second Ecumenical Council, in 381, which was in reality only a synod of bishops from Thrace, Asia, and Syria, convened by Theodosius with a view to uniting the Church upon the basis of the Orthodox faith. No Western bishop was present, nor any Roman legate. From Egypt came only a few bishops, and these tardily. Yet despite its sectional character, the council came in time to be regarded as ecumenical alike in the West and in the East. The council reaffirmed the Nicene faith and denounced all opposing doctrines. The so-called Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, which had almost universally been ascribed to this council, is probably a Jerusalem baptismal formula revised by the interpolation of a few Nicene test words. More recently, it claims to be called Constantinopolitan, has been challenged. It is not found in the earliest records of the Acts of the Council, nor was it referred to by the Councils of Ephesus, 431, nor by the Robber Synod, 449, although both of these confirmed the Nicene faith. At all events, it became the creed of the Universal Church, and has been retained without change, save for the addition of Filioque. On this day in history, July 10th, 138, Emperor Hadrian of Rome dies of heart failure at his residence on the Bay of Naples, Baiae. He is buried at Rome in the tomb of Hadrian besides his late wife, Vibia Sabina. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over Hadrian's travels around the empire. The record of Hadrian's journeys through all parts of the empire forms the chief authority for the events of his life down to the final settlement in the capital during his last years. They can only be briefly touched upon here. His first great journey probably lasted from 121 to 126. After traversing Gaul, he visited the Germanic provinces on the Rhine, and crossed over to Britain, spring of 121, where he built the great rampart from the Tyne to the Solway, which bears his name. This part of his journey was mainly occupied with military inspections. He returned through Gaul into Spain, and then proceeded to Mauritania, where he suppressed an insurrection. A war with the Parthians was averted by a personal interview with their king, 123. From the Parthian frontier he traveled through Asia Minor and the islands of the Aegean to Athens, autumn of 125, where he introduced various political and commercial changes, was initiated at the Eleusinia, and presided at the celebration of the Greater Dionysia. After visiting central Greece and Peloponnesus, he traveled by way of Sicily to Rome, end of 126. The next year was spent at Rome, and after a visit to Africa, which produced measures for the encouragement of African agriculture, he set out on his second great journey, September of 128. He traveled by way of Athens, where he completed and dedicated the buildings begun during his first visit, chief of which was the Olympium. In the spring of 129, he visited Asia Minor and Syria, where he invited the kings and princes of the East to a meeting at Samosata. Khosrow of Parthia declined. Having passed the winter at Antioch, he set out for the south, spring of 130. He ordered Jerusalem to be rebuilt, under the name of Aelia Capitolina, and made his way through Arabia to Egypt, where he restored the tomb of Pompey at Pelusium with great magnificence. After a short stay at Alexandria, he took an excursion up the Nile, during which he lost his favorite, Antinous. From Egypt, Hadrian returned through Syria to Europe. His movements are obscure, but was obliged to hurry back to Palestine, spring of 133, to deal with the Jewish revolt that broke out in 132. For a while, he probably commanded in the field himself. Then in 134, leaving the conduct of affairs in the hands of Julius Severus, He returned to Rome. The remaining years of his life were spent partly in the capital, partly in his villa at Tibur. His health now began to fail, and it became necessary for him to choose a successor. There were rumors that Servianus would be appointed, but he and his grandson Fuscus were put to death in 136. Why is not known. Against the advice of his relatives and friends, he adopted L. Saonius Commodus under the name L. alias Caesar, who was in a feeble state of health and died on January 1st, 138, before he had an opportunity of proving his capabilities. Hadrian then adopted Arrius Antoninus, on condition that he should adopt M. Annius Verus, afterwards the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and the son of L. Aelius Caesar, L. Verus, afterwards co-emperor. Hadrian died at Baiae on July 10th, 138. On this day in history, July 11th, 154, Bardason, Syrian astrologer, scholar, and philosopher, is born. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the teacher. Bardason, born 154 AD, an early teacher of Christianity in Mesopotamia, whose works, saving possibly the Hymn of the Soul in the Acts of Thomas, have perished. Bardason founded a school which was soon branded as heretical. On this day in history, July 12, 1817, Henry David Thoreau, American essayist, poet, and philosopher, is born. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the philosopher and featuring narration from my friend Osword.
Henry David Thoreau, born 1817, died 1862, American recluse, essayist, and writer born in Concord, Massachusetts. July 12, 1817. To Thoreau, this conquered country contained all the beauty and even grandeur that was necessary to the worshipper of nature. He once journeyed to Canada, he went west on one occasion, he sailed and explored a few rivers. For the rest, he haunted Concord and its neighborhood as faithfully as the stork its ancestral nest. As a boy, Henry drove his mother's cow to the pastures, and thus early became enamored of certain aspects of nature and of certain delights of solitude. At school and at Harvard University, he in no wise distinguished himself. Though he was an intellectually receptive student, he read widely. He was, however, proficient enough in Greek, Latin, and the more general acquirements to enable him to act for a time as a teacher. But long before this, he had become apprenticed to the learning of nature. When he was only 12, he made collections for Agassiz, who had just then arrived in America. Thoreau gave up teaching and became a lecturer and author, though it was his labor of his hands which mainly supported him through the many years. Professionally, he was a surveyor. He had arrived at the conviction that the less labor a man did, over and above the positive demands of necessity, the better for him and for the community at large. He would have the order of the week reversed, 6 days of rest and 1 of labor. In 1845, he made his famous experiment of Walden. Desirous of proving as the nest-building bird, Thoreau retired to a hut of his own construction on the pine slope over against the shores of Walden Pond. A hut which he built, furnished, and kept in order entirely by the labor of his own hands. During his 2 years in Walden Woods, he lived by the exercise of a little surveying, a little job working, and the tillage of a few acres of ground which produced him his beans and potatoes. He would read considerably, wrote abundantly, thought actively, if not widely, and came to know beasts, birds, and fishes with an intimacy more extraordinary than what was the case with St. Francis of Assisi. Birds came to his call and forgot the hereditary fear of man. Beasts lipped and caressed him. The very fish in the lake and stream would glide, unfearful, between his hands. His Walden, 1854, the record of his fascinating 2 years' experience, must always remain a production of great interest. Some years before Thoreau took to Walden Woods, he made the chief friendship of his life, that with Emerson. He became one of the famous circle of the Transcendentalists, always keenly preserving his own individuality among more or less potent natures as Emerson, Hawthorne, and Margaret Fuller. From Emerson he gained more than any man, alive or dead, and though the older philosopher both enjoyed and learned from the association with the younger, it cannot be said that the gain was equal. There was nothing electrical in Thoreau's intercourse with his fellow men. Although he absorbed intensely, he gave off no spiritual sparks. With children he was affectionate and gentle, with old people and strangers considerate. He loved his kind as animals, but did not seem to find them as interesting as those furred and feathered. In 1847, Thoreau left Walden Lake abruptly, and for a time occupied himself with lead pencil making, the paternal trade. He never married, thus further fulfilling his policy on what one of his essayist biographers has termed, quote, indulgence in fine renouncements. At the comparatively early age of 45, he died, May 6, 1862. His grave is in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery at Concord. Thoreau's fame will rest on Walden, or Life in the Woods, and The Excursions, though he wrote nothing which is not deserving notice. Up to his 30th year, he dabbled in verse, but he had little ear for metrical music, and he lacked the spiritual impulsiveness of a true poet. His weakness as a philosopher is his tendency to base the laws of the universe on the experience-born, thought-provoked convictions of one man, himself. His weakness as a writer is the too frequent striving after antithesis and paradox. If he had all of his own originality without the itch of appearing original, he would have made his fascination irresistible. As it is, Thoreau holds a unique place. He was a naturalist, but absolutely devoid of the pedantry of science, a keen observer, but no retailer of disjointed facts. He thus holds sway over two domains. He had the adherents of the lover's effect and the children of fancy. He must always be read, whether lovingly or interestingly, for he has all the variable charm, the strange Saturninity, and the contradictions, austerity, and delightful surprises of nature herself.
On this day in history, July 13th, 1919, the British airship R-34 lands in Norfolk, England, completing the first airship return journey across the Atlantic in 182 hours of flight. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of airship development in Great Britain, and featuring narration from my friend, Mike.
Prior to the World War, 1914 to 1918, the British made little, if any, contribution to airship development. A few private experimenters aroused enough interest so that in 1907, the government built a series of 5 small airships from 21,000 to 77,500 cubic feet in volume. 2 French airships were purchased in 1909, and then, apparently alarmed by German progress, the government appropriated $400,000 and started to build an 800,000 cubic foot airship, later dubbed the Mayfly. This ship never did fly, for on September 24, 1911, while being maneuvered from her shed at Barrow, a violent crosswind broke her in two. This called a temporary halt at attempts at rigid airship construction, but a Percival and Astra were bought and proved useful in the service early in the war, 1914 to 1918. During this war period, about 7 non-rigid types were evolved for coast patrol duty and to combat submarines and mines. Best known were the Sea Scout type of 65,000 cubic foot, which came to be called blimps, and the North Sea type of 360,000 cubic feet. Speeds as high as 57.5 miles an hour were attained, and the NS-11 made one flight of 101 hour duration. From June 1917 to October of 1918, there were 56 airships on duty and 59,704 hours of patrol flights that were performed, on which 49 submarines were sighted. In 1918, there were only 9 days on which the airships were not out on patrol duty. Non-rigid activity ceased shortly after the War of 1914 to 1918, but one commercial blimp was built for advertising purposes. After many delays, the rigid airship R-9, which had been started in 1914, was finally completed in 1917. Other rigids ordered in 1915 were of the R-23 class, but none of these airships equaled the products of the experienced Zeppelin designers. However, when the German L-33 was brought down in good condition, she served as a model for the R-33 and the R-34, which were marked in their improvement. In fact, the R-34 had a range enough to make the first transatlantic airship flight, successfully completing a trip to Long Island, New York in 1919 and returning. In August 1918, work was started on the R-38, an airship with a volume of 2,700,000 cubic feet, which was sold by the British to the American government. Delivery by air was planned, but after 3 test flights on which structural and control weaknesses appeared, the airship made a 4th flight, August 24, 1921, on which she broke in 2 in the air, killing 45 British and American officers and men. The R-38 disaster brought British airship activity to a halt. This time until 1924, when an Empire communications scheme was undertaken and two 5 million cubic foot airships were ordered and built. The R-100 to be built by the Airship Guarantee Company and the R-101 by the Air Ministry. A large shed was erected at Karachi, India, and mooring masts were set up in Nishmala, Egypt, and Montreal, Canada. Both airships were to have accommodations inside their hulls for 100 passengers. The R-100 was built on a rather modified Zeppelin type of design, using gasoline engines, and was reported to have cost $2.25 million. In July 1930, she made a trip to Montreal in 79 hours, returning in August in 57 hours. The R-101 deviated substantially from German designs and practice, using steel girders and diesel engines. On an attempted flight, October 5, 1930, to India, she crashed in a storm at Bouquet, France, and burst into flames, killing 47 persons, including Lord Thomson, Air Minister. The government then scrapped the R-100 and abandoned its airship program indefinitely.
On this day in history, July 14th, 1789, storming of the Bastille in Paris. This event escalates the widespread discontent into the French Revolution. Bastille Day is still celebrated annually in France. Including the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the fortification. Bastille. Originally, any fortified building forming part of a system of defense or attack. The name, which is derived from the Old French bastiller, to build, was especially applied to several of the principal points in the ancient fortifications of Paris. In the reign of King John, or even earlier, the gate of St. Antoine was flanked by 2 towers. And about 1369, Hugues Aubrac, at the command of Charles V, changed it into a regular bastille or fort by the adding of 6 others, the whole united by thick walls and surrounded by a ditch 25 feet wide. Extensions and alterations were afterwards effected, but the building remained substantially what it was made by the provost, a 4-square gloomy structure with 8 towers. As the ancient fortifications of the city were superseded, the use of the word Bastille as a general distinction died out, and it became restricted to the castle of St. Antoine. The building had originally a military purpose, and it appears as a fortress on several occasions in French history. When Charles VII retook Paris from the English in 1436, his opponents in the city took refuge in the Bastille, but the want of provisions obliged them to capitulate. In 1588, the Duke of Guise took possession of it, and soon afterwards shut up the whole Parliament within its walls, for having refused their adherence to the League. When Henry IV became master of Paris, he committed the command of the Bastille to Sully, and there he deposited his treasures. On January 13th, 1649, the Bastille capitulated to the forces of the Fronde, which, by the terms of the treaty made with the court in March, remained in possession of it till October 21st, 1651. Very early, however, the Bastille was used for the custody of state prisoners, and it was ultimately more of a prison than a fortress. According to popular tradition, the first who was incarcerated within its walls was the builder himself, Hugues Aubrac. It was not until the reign of Louis XIII that it became recognized as a regular place of confinement, but from that time till its destruction it was frequently filled with men and women of every condition. Prisoners were detained without trial on lettres de cachet, often to satisfy personal animosities. But the most notorious use of the Bastille was to imprison those who criticized the government or persons in power. It was this which made it so hated and caused its capture by the revolutionary forces on July 14, 1789, to be regarded as symbolizing the downfall of despotism. The treatment of prisoners in the Bastille varied greatly in different cases. The prisoners were divided into 2 main classes: those detained on grounds of precaution or by way of admonitory correction, and those who lay under presumption or proof of guilt. The former were subject to no investigation or judgment, and the length of their imprisonment depended on the will of the king. The latter were brought to trial in the ordinary courts or before special tribunals, though even in such cases as these it was possible for a man to grow old in the prison without being tried at all. Until convicted, the prisoner was registered in the king's name, and, except in the case of state prisoners of importance, who were often kept in absolute isolation, he enjoyed a certain degree of comfort and freedom. Visitors were admitted under restriction, games were allowed, and for a long time at least exercise in open parts of the interior. Food was abundant and good, at least for the better class of prisoners. When the prisoner was convicted, his name was transferred to the register of the commission, and he became exposed to numerous hardships and even barbarities, which, however, belonged not so much to the special organization of the Bastille as to the general system of criminal justice then in force. Among the more distinguished personages who were confined in the fortress during the reigns of Louis XIV, XV, and XVI were the famous Man of the Iron Mask, Fouquet, the Marshal Richelieu, Voltaire, Lally Tolendal, and the Cardinal de Rohan, while the system of imprisonment by lettres de cachet, which were often given in blank to favored courtiers and sometimes even sold by ministers, cannot be too strongly condemned. It is unnecessary to believe all the tales of horror which found currency during the Revolution, and which historical evidence tends to modify, and even in many cases to refute altogether. Much light has been shed on the history of the Bastille from its own records. These documents were flung out into the courts of the building by the revolutionary captors, and after suffering grievous diminution and damage were stored up and forgotten in the vaults of the library of the so-called Arsenal. Here they were discovered in 1840 by François Ravesson, who edited them for publication. At the time of its capture, only 7 prisoners were found in the Bastille, which, soon after, was razed to the ground by order of the new municipality of Paris. The site of the building is now marked by a column of bronze dedicated to the memory of the patriots of July 1789 and 1830. On this day in history, July 15th, 1741, Alexei Cherikov sights land in southeast Alaska. He sends men ashore on a longboat, making them the first Europeans to visit Alaska. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the exploration and early history of Alaska. In the early exploration of the northwest coast of America, Spain was first in the field, but there is little evidence to prove that any Spanish navigator sailed as far north as Alaska. Later, and during the period of active Russian exploration, a number of expeditions were sent north from Mexico, and at one time Spain claimed the sole right to navigate the waters of the northern Pacific and issued a prohibition against other nations trading in those waters. Many Spanish names of places along the coast remain today to attest the extent of these explorations. Spain does not appear to have pressed her claims, however, and gradually ceased her efforts in this direction. This may have been due to disputes on her hands in other parts of the world, or to the wide extent at that time of the Spanish claims in the Western Hemisphere, or possibly, in part, to the fact that the climatic conditions of this northern region did not appeal strongly to a people whose life and activities had been spent in warmer climes. To the Russian, on the other hand, these regions were as home. During the latter half of the 17th century, the Russians had been pushing their explorations across Siberia and along the eastern and northern shores of Asia. In 1728, Vitus Bering passed through the strait named after him, and Gerosdev sighted the American coast in 1731. Bering's second expedition, in company with Cherikov, sailed from the Siberian coast in 1741. The mainland of America was located and numerous islands visited. This expedition is commonly accepted as fixing the date of the discovery of Alaska. Bering's ship was wrecked in early November on what is now called Bering Island. The crew made such provision as was possible against the cold of the approaching winter, but the privations and hardships were very great. It was under such circumstances that Vitus Bering died on this cold, forbidding isle, under the sky of an Arctic winter, December 8, 1741. During the 30 or 35 years following, the Russians were active in exploring the coast and islands and in establishing a trade with the natives. About the time the American colonies were making their struggle for separation from the mother country, England was beginning her part of the exploration of this northwest coast. 3 names stand high in the record of these explorations: Cook, Vancouver, and Mackenzie. Cook's expedition sailed from England in July 1776. In the personnel of his expedition were men from the American colonies, and Vancouver, then a midshipman, was at the party. The work begun by Cook was continued by Vancouver during the years 1791 to 1794. Dahl expressed the view generally held concerning Vancouver's work in the statement that the explorations which carried out may have not been excelled by any other navigator, and were faithfully and thoroughly performed. The Hudson's Bay Company was meanwhile advancing its trade and extending its influence westward from the interior of Canada. In 1793, Alexander Mackenzie crossed the continent by land to the Gulf of Georgia, returning by the same route. This expedition, although little known, may well be compared with that of Lewis and Clark in respect both of the difficulties encountered and its value to his company and government. The excesses committed by private traders and companies who robbed, massacred, and hideously abused the native Indians caused the Russian government in 1799 to confine the trade and regulation of its American possessions to a semi-official corporation called the Russian American Company for a term of 20 years, afterwards twice renewed for similar periods. Alexander Baranoff, chief resident director of the American companies, 1790 to 1819, and one of the administrators of the new company, became famous through the success he achieved as governor. He founded Sitka in 1804 after the massacre by the natives of the inhabitants of the earlier settlement, 1799, at an adjacent point. The headquarters of the company were at Kodiak until 1805, and thereafter at Sitka. In 1821, Russia attempted to exclude navigators from the Bering Sea and the Pacific coast of her possessions. This led to immediate protest from the United States and Great Britain. The outcome was a treaty with the United States in 1824 and one with Great Britain in 1825, by which the excessive demands of Russia were relinquished and the boundaries of the Russian possessions were established. In the convention with Great Britain, it was agreed that Russia should have the narrow strip of north coast of 54 degrees 40 minutes and the peninsula and islands westward of the 141st meridian. The last charter of the Russian-American Company expired on December 31st, 1861, and Prince Maksutov, an imperial governor, was appointed to administer the affairs of the territory. Authority was granted to an American company in 1864 to make explorations for a proposed Russo-American Company's telegraph line overland from the Amur River in Siberia to Bering Strait, and through Alaska to British Columbia. Work was begun on this scheme in 1865 and continued for nearly 3 years, when the success of the Atlantic cable rendered the construction of the line unnecessary and it was given up. But not until important exploration had been made. Much of this information was made public in 1870 by W. H. Dahl in his book Alaska and Its Resources. The first official overtures by the United States for the purchase of Russian America were made by Senator Gwin of California, 1859, during the presidency of James Buchanan. This movement, however, was checked temporarily by the Civil War, which soon followed. The fishing interests of northwestern United States were next to manifest an interest in the territory to the northward. In 1866, a memorial was adopted by the legislature of the Washington Territory in reference to the cod and other fisheries and delivered to President Johnson. By a treaty signed on March 30th, 1867, the purchase was consummated for the sum of $7,200,000, and on October 18, 1867, the formal transfer of the territory was made at Sitka. On this day in history, July 16, 1769, Father Junipero Serra founds California's first mission, Misión San Diego de Alicaya. Over the following decades, it evolves into the city of San Diego, California. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. San Diego, a city of California, USA, on the Pacific Ocean, 10 miles from the Mexican border, a port of entry, the county seat of San Diego County, and the site of extensive activity of the United States Army and Navy. It is the terminus of the Pacific Coast Highway and of the several transcontinental highways from the Atlantic coast which proceed westward from El Paso over practically the same route, and is served by the San Diego and Arizona Eastern of the Southern Pacific lines and Santa Fe railways, motorbus lines, and many coastal, intercoastal, and foreign steamship lines. A municipal airport, Lindbergh Field, of 413 acres, to accommodate both sea and land planes, is on the bay, within 5 minutes' drive of the business section of the city, and there are several commercial and governmental aviation fields. Population from 1930, 147,995. From 1940, 203,341. 95% native white. Estimated population of 1941, 300,000 due to the national defense expansion. The city has a land area of 95.3 square miles around the bay, and extending back 10.5 miles at the extreme width. The climate is equable, with an average annual mean temperature of 61 degrees Fahrenheit and an average annual precipitation, nearly all falling in the water, of 10 inches. San Diego Bay is a crescent-shaped basin 14 miles long, separated from the ocean by a low, narrow sand spit, extending west from the mainland below the city and expanding at its western end into two peninsulas, one of which occupied by the city of Coronado, directly opposite San Diego, the other, North Island, by U.S. Navy aviation bases. The business district of the city has, in recent years, assumed a metropolitan appearance with many tall and massive stores, office buildings, and hotels. The residential section is built around Balboa Park, 1,400 acres, the site of the Panama-California Exposition of 1915-16 and of the 1935-36 California Pacific International Exposition. It contains an archaeological institute with valuable exhibits of ancient American art, architecture, and anthropology. A replica of a Pueblo Indian village constructed for the exposition and now used by the Boy Scouts, zoological and botanical gardens, a natural history museum, a pavilion with a great outdoor organ on which recitals are given throughout the year, and a stadium seating 30,000 occupying a natural amphitheater. At La Jolla, on the ocean, 15 miles north-northwest in the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, affiliated with the University of California, the only institution of its kind in the West. Since 1931, the city has operated under a city-manager form of government. The assessed valuation of property in 1940 was $150 million. Long recognized as one of the country's finest vacation centers, San Diego boasts a wealth of recreational opportunities, water sports, including speedboats, aquaplaning, yachting, swimming, and rowing, may be enjoyed on its bays, harbor, and beaches, while on land the entire gamut of sporting activities are available to resident and tourist alike. In nearby mountain ranges, winter sports including skiing and sledding are available in season, and desert expanses close by are popular for their scenic beauty. Two famous racetracks, the Del Mar Turf Club and the Agua Caliente track, provide horse racing fans enjoyment the year round. The city is the home of many flying and gliding clubs, and deep-sea fishermen find San Diego waters unsurpassed anywhere on the Pacific coast for game fishing. Lakes in the back country provide ample freshwater fishing opportunities. The roomy natural harbor, landlocked, free from currents, and accessible at all seasons, is the first U.S. port of call for vessels operating through the Panama Canal. It has an area of 21 square miles, a channel 2,000 feet wide with a controlling depth of 40 feet at mean low water. Has been provided by government and municipal improvements begun in 1875. Terminal facilities include 41 wharves, 2 of which are large municipal piers, and 21,510 feet of berthing space, excluding government-owned wharves. Since 1911, when the tidelands were ceded to the city by the state, about $15 million has been spent in improvements. The cargo handled in 1940 amounted to 658,978 tons, valued at $30,037,369, and represent largely domestic commerce. Aviation is San Diego's largest, most important industry, employing approximately 30,000 workers. 1941. Consolidated Aircraft, manufacturing flying boats and huge land bombers, is the largest integrated aircraft plant in the world. 1941. Ryan Solar and Roar Aircraft are other important factories. The weekly aircraft payroll is estimated at 625,000. 1941. Fisheries are also important industries, employing about 1,500 fishermen and 1,900 cannery industries. About 107,587,893 pounds of fish entered the port in 1939, and value of the pack was $10,759,689. More than 500 industrial and manufacturing plants produced products valued at about $156 million. 1940. Total payroll in San Diego, including civilian, military, and governmental workers, approximated $155 million. 1940. The manufactured products are diversified, the most important being aircraft, canned fish, kelp products, boats, parachutes, building materials, and canned fruits and vegetables. San Diego is the headquarters for the 11th Naval District, with a personnel of about 32,000 officers and men, and the site of the largest naval operating base of the Pacific Coast, embracing the Naval Air Station, Marine Base, Fuel Depot, Supply Depot, Destroyer Base, radio stations, submarine base, hospital, and training station. Fort Rosecrans is an important military post. Camp Callan at Torrey Pines is an Army cantonment for training selectees, capacity approximately 10,000, 1941. Camp Morena at Campo is the site of a cavalry training base, personal capacity 2,000, 1941. In addition to the aviation activities of the Army and Navy, in progress there since 1917, there are 16 commercial aviation firms of importance, manufacturing planes, motors, and parachutes, conducting training schools, and operating passenger and freight services. Many world records in aviation have been established by the Army and Navy at San Diego, and it has been the scene of such feats as the taking of the first photographs from the air, 1911, the first night flying, the first refueling in flight, and the first seaplane flight in the world. San Diego Bay was discovered in 1942 by the Portuguese navigator Cabrillo in the service of Spain, and was named in 1602 by the Spanish explorer Vizcaino. At Old Town, in North San Diego, the first European settlement in Upper California was made in 1969. On July 16th, Father Junipero Serra founded the mission of San Diego de Icaya, the first of the 21 Franciscan missions in the state, and a little later, a military presidio was established. The mission was moved in 1774 to a site 8 miles from the center of the present city, where it still stands in fair preservation. San Diego began the revolt against Governor Victoria in 1831, but in 1836 was intensely loyal to Mexican authority, in opposition to Governor Alvarado and the northern towns. It was made a port of entry in 1828, and in 1840 had a population of 140. In July 1846 it was occupied by American forces under General Fremont, who raised the first American flag to fly in California. In 1850 it was incorporated as a city, but as it did not grow, it lost its charter in 1852. In 1867 there were only a dozen inhabitants. Then a pioneer builder, A.E. Horton, died 1909, laid out a new city 3 miles below the old site. By 1870 it had a population of 2,300, and in that year the military reservation was established on Point Loma. In 1871 work started on the Santa Fe Railroad. In 1872 the new city was incorporated. In 1874 it was made a port of entry. The boom was ended by the Depression of 1873 to 76, but development was resumed when the railroad reached the city in 1884. By 1890, the population had grown to 16,159. In the following decade, the increase again was slight, but between 1900 and 1910, it amounted to 124%. between 1910 and 1920 to 89%, from 1920 to 1930, 99%, and 1930 to 1940, 37.4%. In the decade 1930 to 40, new buildings for which permits were issued represented an aggregate value of $72,849,444. Bank debits totaled $688,713,796 from 1940. During the first quarter of 1941, building permits exceeded $27 million. On this day in history, July 17th, 1717, King George I of Great Britain sails down the River Thames with a barge of 50 musicians, where George Friedrich Handel's Water Music is premiered. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over Handel's career in England. Handel at the time contemplated a visit to England, and he accepted this offer on condition of leave of absence being granted to him for that purpose. To England, accordingly, Handel journeyed after a short stay at Hanover, arriving in London towards the close of 1710. He came as a composer of Italian opera, and earned his first success at the Haymarket with Rinaldo, composed, to the consternation of the hurried librettist, in a fortnight, and first performed on February 24th, 1711. In this opera, the aria Lascio ch'io pianga found its final home. The work was produced with the utmost magnificence, and Addison's delightful reviews in The Spectator poked fun at it from an unmusical point of view in a way that would have pleased Gluck 50 years afterwards. The success was so great, especially for Walsh, the publisher, that Handel proposed that Walsh should compose the next opera, and that he, Handel, should publish it. He returned to Hanover at the close of the opera season and composed a good deal of vocal chamber music for the Princess Caroline, the stepdaughter of the Elector, besides the instrumental works known to us as the oboe concertos. In 1712, Handel returned to London and spent a year with Andrews, a rich musical amateur, in Barn Elms, Surrey. 3 more years were spent in Burlington, in the neighborhood of London. He evidently was but little inclined to return to Hanover in spite of his duties to the court there. 2 Italian operas and the Utrecht Te Deum, written by the command of Queen Anne, are the principal works of this period. It was awkward for the composer when his deserted master came to London in 1714 as George I of England. For some time Handel did not venture to appear at court, and it was only at the intercession of Baron Kielmansegg that his pardon was obtained. The king received the composer in his good graces and granted him a salary of £400 a year. Later Handel became music master to the little princesses and was given an additional £200 by the Princess Caroline. In 1716 he followed the king to Germany, where he wrote a second German passion to the popular poems of Brock's, a text which, divested of its worst features, forms the basis of several of the arias in Bach's Passions, according to St. John. This was Handel's last work to the German text. A copy much more accurate than Handel's autograph exists in Bach's handwriting. The water music was composed expressly for the occasion of a royal water picnic on the Thames in July 1717. On this day in history, July 18th, 477 BC, Battle of the Cremera, as part of the Roman-Etruscan Wars. Veii ambushes and defeats the Roman army. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the stream. Cremera, a small stream in Etruria, modern-day Fosso della Valcetta, which falls into the Tiber about 6 miles north of Rome. The identification with the Fosso della Valcetta is assured by Livy's statement that the Saxa Rubra were not far off, and this we know to be the Roman name of the post station of Prima Porta, 9 miles from Rome on the Via Flaminia. It is famous for the defeat of the 300 Fabii, who had established a fortified post on its banks. On this day in history, July 19th, 1333, as part of the Wars of Scottish Independence, the Battle of Halidon Hill occurs, in which the English win a decisive victory over the Scots. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. Battle of Halidon Hill. When the Scottish War was renewed after a 4 years uneasy truce, this battle on July 19th, 1333, proved the sequel to the unauthorized expedition and Battle of Dublin and confirmed the changed balance of fortune. Bruce was dead and the Scots neglected to fulfill his testament of guerrilla warfare. Compared with Bannockburn, the strategic situation was also reversed, for in 1333 Edward III was besieging Berwick and a great Scottish host marched to relieve it. With him were Balliol and Beaumont, the victors of Dublin, and there is little doubt that his tactics were inspired by their advice and experience. His force was drawn up in 3 battles, composed of dismounted knights and men-at-arms, with archers on the wings. When the Scottish impetus failed and disorganization spread, Edward ordered his knights to mount and charge until the Scottish host was a dissolved rabble. On this day in history, July 20th, 1715, as part of the 7th Ottoman-Venetian War, the Ottoman Empire captures Nauplia, the capital of the Republic of Venice's Kingdom of the Morea, thereby opening the way to the swift Ottoman reconquest of the Morea. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town and featuring narration from my friend Ungulus.
Nauplia, a town in the Peloponnesus at the head of the Argolic Gulf, the seaport of the plain in which Argos and Mycenae are situated, with several tombs of the Mycenaean age. A hero, Nauplios, took part in the Argonautic expedition. Another was king of Euboea. In classical times it was of no importance, and Pausanias, about 150 AD, found it deserted. The mythic importance of the town revived in the Middle Ages, when it became chief city of the Morea. It was captured in 1211 by Godfrey of Bouillon with the help of Venetian ships. A French dynasty ruled in it for some time and established feudalism. In 1388, the Venetians bought Argos and Nauplia. In the wars between Venice and the Turks, it often changed masters. Given to the Turks in 1540, it was recaptured by Venice in 1686, and the Palamidi hill overhanging the town was fortified. In 1715, it was taken by the Turks. In 1770, the Russians occupied it for a short time. The Greeks captured it during the War of Independence on the 12th of December, 1822, and it was the seat of the Greek administration till 1833, when Athens became the capital of the country. It is the chief town of the department of Ungulus. Population is 7,600.
On this day in history, July 21st, 1545, the first landing of French troops on the coast of the Isle of Wight during the French invasion of the Isle of Wight. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the island. Relics of the Roman occupation following conquest by Vespasian in 43 AD are the villas at Brading and Carisbrooke, the cemetery at Newport, and remains of foundations at Comley Farm, Gurnet, and between Brixton and Calbourne. The Jutes probably settled here, and in 661 it was annexed by Wulfhere to Wessex, and subsequently bestowed on the King of Sussex. In 998 it was the headquarters of the Danes. From the 14th to the 16th century the isle was under fear of invasion by the French, who, in 1377, burnt Yarmouth and Francheville, the latter being subsequently rebuilt and known as Newtown, and so devastated Newport that it lay uninhabited for 2 years. In 1419, a French force landed and demanded tribute in the name of King Richard and Queen Isabella, which was refused, and the French returned home. Another raid was attempted in 1545 when a French fleet of 225 ships drew up off Brading Harbor and wrought much destruction. As a result, an organized system of defense was planned. Forts were constructed at Kew, Sandown, Freshwater, and Yarmouth. Charles I was imprisoned in Carisbrooke Castle in 1647-48, and, in 1650, his 2 children, the Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Gloucester, the former dying there. The lordship of the island was granted by William the Conqueror to William Fitzosborne, but escheated to the crown. It was bestowed by Henry I on Richard de Redvers, whose descendant, Isabella de Fortibus, sold it to Edward I in 1293. In the Domesday Survey, 29 mills are mentioned, and salt works at Borehunt, Bowcombe, Watchingwell, and Whitfield. The island quarries have been worked from remote times, that of Quar, supplying material for Winchester Cathedral. Alum and sand for glassmaking were formerly obtained at Alum Bay, while members returned to Parliament for the whole island. Antiquities include British pit villages, Rowborough, prehistoric tumuli on several of the chalk downs, the so-called Long Stone at Modeston, a lofty sandstone monolith, well-preserved examples of tessellated Roman pavements near Brading, Carisbrooke Castle, a beautiful ruin built upon the site of an ancient British stronghold, the remains of Quar Abbey near Ryde. The most noteworthy ancient churches are those of Bonchurch, Norman, Brading, Transitional Norman and Early English, Shawfleet, Norman and Decorated, and Carisbrooke, of various styles. On this day in history, July 22nd, 1099, as part of the First Crusade, Godfrey of Bouillon is elected the first defender of the Holy Sepulchre of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Crusader. Godfrey of Bouillon, born circa 1060, died 1100. A leader in the First Crusade, was the second son of Eustace II, Count of Bouillon, by his marriage with Ida, daughter of Duke Godfrey II of Lower Lorraine. He was designated by Duke Godfrey as his successor, but the Emperor Henry IV gave him only the Mark of Antwerp, in which the lordship of Bouillon was included, 1076. He fought for Henry, however, both on the Elster and in the Siege of Rome, and he was invested in 1082 with the Duchy of Lower Lorraine. Lorraine had been penetrated by Cluniac influences, and Godfrey would seem to have been a man of notable piety. Accordingly, though he had himself served as an imperialist, and though the Germans in general had little sympathy with the Crusaders, Godfrey, nevertheless, when the call came to follow Christ, almost literally sold all that he had and followed. Along with his brothers Eustace and Baldwin, the future Baldwin I of Jerusalem, Godfrey led a German contingent, some 40,000 strong, along Charlemagne's road, through Hungary to Constantinople, starting in August 1096, and arriving at Constantinople in November. He was the first of the crusading princes to arrive, and on him fell the duty of deciding what the relations of the princes to the Eastern Emperor Alexius were to be. Eventually he did homage to Alexius in January 1097, and his example was followed by the other princes. From this time until the beginning of 1099, Godfrey appears as one of the minor princes, while men like Bohemund and Raymond, Baldwin and Tancred were determining the course of events. In 1099 he came once more to the front. The mass of the Crusaders were weary of the political factions which divided some of their leaders, and Godfrey, who was more of a pilgrim than a politician, became the natural representative of this feeling. He was thus able to force the reluctant Raymond to march southward to Jerusalem, and he took a prominent part in the siege, his division being the first to enter when the city was captured. It was natural, therefore, that, when Raymond of Provence refused the offered dignity, Godfrey should be elected ruler of Jerusalem, July 22, 1099. The new dignity proved more onerous than honorable, and during his short reign of a year, Godfrey had to combat the Arabs of Egypt, and the opposition of Raymond and the Patriarch Dagobert. He was successful in repelling the Egyptian attack at the Battle of Ascalon, August 1099, but he failed, owing to Raymond's obstinacy and greed, to acquire the town of Ascalon after the battle. Left alone at the end of the autumn, with an army of some 2,000 men, Godfrey was yet able, in the spring of 1100, probably with the aid of new pilgrims, to exact tribute from towns like Acre, Ascalon, Arsuf, and Caesarea. But already at the end of 1099, Dagobert, Archbishop of Pisa, had been substituted as Patriarch for Arnulf, who had been acting as vicar by the influence of Bohemund, and Dagobert, whose vassal Godfrey had at once piously acknowledged himself, seems to have forced himself to an agreement in April 1100, by which he promised Jerusalem and Jaffa to the Patriarch, in case he should acquire in their place Cairo or some other town, or should die without issue. Thus were the foundations of a theocracy laid in Jerusalem, and when Godfrey died, July 1100, he left the question to be decided whether a theocracy or a monarchy should be the government of the Holy Land. Because he had been the first ruler of Jerusalem, Godfrey was idolized in later saga. He was depicted as the leader of the Crusades, the King of Jerusalem, the legislator who laid down the assizes of Jerusalem. He was none of these things. Bohemond was the leader of the Crusades. Baldwin was first king. The assizes were the result of a gradual development. In reality, he would seem to have been a quiet, pious, hard-fighting knight, who was chosen to rule in Jerusalem because he had no dangerous qualities and no obvious defects. Godfrey was the principal hero of two French chansons de geste dealing with the crusade, the Chanson d'Antioche and the Chanson de Jerusalem. In addition, the parentage and early exploits of Godfrey were made the subject of legend. His grandfather was said to be Helios, Knight of the Swan, one of the brothers whose adventures are well known, though with some variation, in the familiar fairy tale of the Seven Swans. Helios, drawn by the swan, one day disembarked at Neerwinden and reconquered her territory for the Duchess of Bouillon. Marrying her daughter, he exacted a promise that his wife should not inquire into his origin. The tale, which is almost identical with the Lohengrin legend, belongs to the class of the Cupid and Psyche narratives. On this day in history, July 23, 1829, in the United States, William Aston Burt patents the typographer, a precursor to the typewriter. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the early machines of the typewriter. The first recorded attempt to invent a typewriter is found in the records of the British Patent Office. These show that on January 7, 1714, a patent was granted by Queen Anne to Henry Mill, an English engineer, for an artificial machine or method for the impressing or transcribing of letters singly or progressively one after another, as in writing, whereby all writing whatever may be engrossed in paper or parchment so neat and exact as not to be distinguished from print. Mill's machine was never manufactured. Only one other attempt was recorded in the 18th century. This was a machine invented in 1784 for embossing characters for the blind. The first American patent on a typewriter was granted in 1829 to William Austin Burt of Detroit. The only model of this machine was destroyed by fire at the Washington Patent Office in 1836. In 1833, a French patent was granted to Xavier Progin, or Progin, of Marseille, for a device which he described as a cryptographic machine or pen. It consisted of an assembly of bars with type, each type striking downward upon a common center. The Progin device was the prototype of all our present type bar machines. The next important step was taken by Charles Thurber of Worcester, Massachusetts, to whom an American patent was granted in 1843. In this machine, the letter spacing was effected by the longitudinal movement of a cylinder or platen, a principle which is a feature of all present-day standard writing machines. A different model, brought out by Thurber in the year 1845, was designed to perform the motions of the hand in writing and was intended for the blind. In the previous year, a machine, also intended for the blind, was shown by Littledale at the New York meeting of the British Association. Pierre Foucault, a teacher in the Paris Institute for the Blind, patented a machine in 1849 that was shown at the Great Exhibition in London in 1851 and is said to have embossed characters for the blind admirably. From 1850, the attempts became more numerous. Among those who took out patents in America during this period were Oliver T. Eddy of Baltimore in 1850, J.D. Fairbanks, 1850, J.M. Jones of Clyde, New York, 1852, R.S. Thompson of Wilmington, North Carolina, 1854, Alfred Eli Beach of New York, 1856, J.H. Cooper of Philadelphia, 1856, Dr. Samuel W. Francis of New York, 1857, Henry Harger, 1858, F.A. DeMay of New York, 1863, Benjamin Livermore of Hartland, Vermont, 1863, Abner Peeler of Webster City, Iowa, 1866, Thomas Hall, 1867, and John Pratt of Center, Alabama, who in 1866, while a resident in London, produced a device called the pterotype, wing type, which operated on the type wheel principle. Contemporary efforts by European inventors were those of Sir Charles Wheatstone in England, who constructed several experimental models between 1855 and 60. The Revisa machine in Italy belongs to that period, and the models built by Peter Mitterhofer of the Tyrol in 1864 and 1866. Among the most promising of these efforts were those of Beech and Francis. Beech's machine operated in much the same manner as a modern typewriter, but it wrote only on a narrow ribbon of paper. This machine, like so many others of this period, was designed for the blind, and printed raised letters which could be read by touch. The machine invented by Dr. Francis was a bulky affair, with keys like those of a piano. Type bars were arranged in a circle, printing at a common center. On this day in history, July 24th, 1847, after 17 months of travel, Brigham Young leads 148 Mormon pioneers into Salt Lake Valley, resulting in the establishment of Salt Lake City. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. The history of the city is bound up with that of the Mormons and of the state. On July 22, 1847, an advance party of Mormons, led by Orson Pratt and Erastus Snow, in search of a place where they might colonize in peace and safety, entered the Salt Lake Valley. On July 24th, Brigham Young arrived and approved of the site, and on July 28th he chose the spot for the temple. Plowing and planting were begun forthwith. The hard sun-baked earth was flooded by building a dam in City Creek Canyon, and an irrigation system was devised. The city was named the City of the Great Salt Lake, and was so called until 1868. Before the end of 1847, the main body of the people arrived. A theocratic government was set up, with a bishop in charge of each of the 19 wards into which the community was divided. The settlers were American citizens squatting on the foreign soil, for the region at that time belonged to Mexico, and they were practically beyond the reach of any civil government, as their leaders had desired. This isolation was of brief duration. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, at the close of the Mexican War, transferred the region to the United States, and after the discovery of gold in California, the city was overrun with caravans of treasure seekers. Many of the colonists deserted to join the stream of prospectors, notwithstanding the attitude of their leader, who opposed the exploitation of mineral wealth, even in Utah, and whose ideal was a community of farmers, merchants, and manufacturers. Those who stayed at home grew rich as outfitters. There was a considerable immigration from Europe in the early years, especially from England, where the Mormon missions were very successful. By 1850, the city had a population of 6,000. It was chartered in 1851 by the territorial legislature of Utah. After the Civil War, the non-Mormon population steadily increased, and there was a long period of conflict between the opposing elements, as well as officially between the Mormon Church and the U.S. government over the practice of polygamy and other matters of dispute, all of which, happily, is now long past. On this day in history, July 25th, 1538, the city of Guayaquil is founded by the Spanish conquistador Francisco de Orellana, and given the name Muy Noble y Muy Leal Ciudad de Santiago de Guayaquil. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Guayaquil, or Santiago de Guayaquil, a city and port of Ecuador, capital of the province of Goiás, on the right bank of the Goiás River, 33 miles above its entrance into the Gulf of Guayaquil, in 2 degrees 1 minute 18 seconds south, 79 degrees 51 minutes 46.25 seconds west. Population estimated from 1942, 159,937. The city is on a comparatively level plain extending southward from the base of 3 low hills called Santa Carmen de la Cruz, between the river and the partially filled waters of the Estero Salado. It is about 30 feet above sea level. The lower parts of the town are partially flooded in the rainy season, but this has recently been improved by raising and paving streets. The old town is the upper or northern part and is inhabited by the poorer classes, its streets being badly paved, crooked, and pestilential. The Great Fire of 1896 destroyed a large part of the town, and some of its insanitary conditions were improved in rebuilding. The southern part is the business and residential quarter of the better classes. The buildings were chiefly of wood and the streets only surface drained, but sewerage systems have been installed and in some sections only stone or concrete may be used for building. An imposing governor's palace has recently been built of concrete. Other public buildings are the Bishop's Palace, Town Hall, Cathedral, and 9 churches, National College, Episcopal Seminary, and schools of law and medicine, theater, 2 hospitals, custom house, several asylums and charitable institutions, and a new concrete municipal building containing a library and museum. Guayaquil is also the seat of a university with faculties of law, medicine, engineering, economics, social services, and architecture. The upper floors in business streets project over the walks, forming covered arcades. The year is divided into a wet January to May and a dry season. During the former, the hot days are followed by nights of drenching rain. The mean annual temperature is about 78 degrees to 79 degrees Fahrenheit, but the dry or summer season is considered pleasant and healthful. Malaria, bilious fevers, Guayaquil fever, and yellow fever were formerly prevalent in Guayaquil, but the engineering and hygienic achievements which have been accomplished by the government in cooperation with the Rockefeller Foundation have so greatly improved the sanitary conditions of the city that it now has an A1 rating in terms of the stringent requirements of the Pan-American Sanitary Code. The water supply is brought in iron mains from the Cordilleras, 53 miles distant. The mains pass under the Goyas River and discharge into a distributing reservoir of Santa Ana Hill, north of the city. There are several urban and interurban railways, the important ones being the Empresa Eléctrica del Ecuador, the Empresa de Carros Urbanos, and the Customs House Railway. A railway and highway are planned which will connect Guayaquil with Babahoyo, and one of the most traveled roads in Ecuador runs from Guayaquil to Salinas. Regular plane service is maintained with Quito. The Panagra planes stop overnight in the city. Guayaquil has telephone and electric light services, and telegraph communication is through the All-American Cables Incorporated, whose cable lands at the small port of Salinas about 100 miles west. Connected by rail with Guayaquil, the port is a fashionable resort noted for its beach, fishing, and climate. Railway connection was established with Quito, 278 miles, in 1908. Steamboats go to the producing districts of the province along the Goyas River and its tributaries, on which boats run regularly as far as Babahoyo, 80 miles, in the dry season, and for a distance of 40 miles on the Rio Dula. Smaller boats navigate about 200 miles of this river system. Nearly all the exports of Ecuador are shipped through the port of Guayaquil. The Goyas River is navigable up to Guayaquil for steamers drawing 22 feet. Larger vessels anchor at Puna, 40 miles below Guayaquil, where cargoes and passengers are transferred to lighters and tenders. At Guayaquil there is a quay along the river front, but the water alongside does not exceed 18 feet, and steamers anchor a considerable distance out in the Goyas. Santiago de Guayaquil was founded on January 25, 1535, by Sebastian de Benalcazar, at the mouth of the Rio Babahoyo, then moved to the Estero, at that time named Dima, and finally located on its present site by Francisco de Orellana in 1537. It was captured and sacked several times by pirates and freebooters in 1624, by the Dutchman Jacob Hermite Clark in 1683, Edward David's crew, and in 1709. Owing to the flimsy construction of its buildings, Guayaquil has been repeatedly burned, the great fires occurring in 1707, 1764, 1865, 1896, and 1899. The city was made the see of a bishop in 1837. On this day in history, July 26, 1529, Francisco Pizarro Gonzalez, Spanish conquistador, is appointed governor of Peru. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the conquistador. Francisco Pizarro, born circa 1471 or 1475, died 1541. Discoverer and conqueror of Peru, was born at Trujillo in Extremadura, Spain. about 1471 or 1475. He was an illegitimate son of Gonzalo Pizarro. Of Pizarro's early years, hardly anything is known, but he appears to have been poorly cared for, and his education was neglected. Shortly after the news of the discovery of the New World had reached Spain, he was in Seville, and thence found his way across the Atlantic. There he is heard of in 1510 as having taken part in the expedition from Hispaniola to Orba, under Alonso de Ojeda, by whom he was entrusted with the charge of the unfortunate settlement of San Sebastian. He accompanied Balboa, whom he afterwards helped to bring to the block, in the discovery of the Pacific. In 1522 he entered into a partnership with a priest named Hernando de Luque and a soldier named Diego de Almagro, for purposes of exploration and conquest towards the south. Explorations were then undertaken down the west coast of South America, in which Pizarro was left for months with but 13 followers on the island of Gallo, without ship or stores. There it was that Pizarro displayed the courage which has made famous the story of himself and his companions. Some authorities, among them Xeres, Pizarro's secretary, give the number of his companions as 16. Herrera states the names of 13. Garcilaso supplies the remaining 3. But Pizarro persisted till he had coasted as far as about 9 degrees south, and obtained distinct accounts of the Peruvian Empire. The governor of Panama showing little disposition to encourage the adventurers, Pizarro resolved to apply to the sovereign in person for help, and with this object sailed from Panama for Spain, accompanied by Pedro de Candia, in the spring of 1528, reaching Seville in early summer. Charles V was won over. Pizarro was decorated with the Order of Santiago, was granted a coat of arms, and 13 of his historic companions were ennobled by name. On July 26, 1529, he was executed at Toledo the famous Capitulation, by which Pizarro was upon certain conditions made governor and captain general of the province of New Castile for the distance of 200 leagues along the newly discovered coast, and invested with all the authority and prerogatives of a viceroy, his associates being left in wholly secondary positions. One of the conditions of the grant was that within 6 months Pizarro should raise a sufficiently equipped force of men, of whom 100 might be drawn from the colonies. As he could not make up his due complement, he sailed clandestinely from San Lucar in January 1530. He was afterwards joined by his brother Hernando with the remaining vessels, and when the expedition left Panama in January of the following year, it numbered 3 ships, 180 men, and 27 horses. The subsequent movements of Pizarro belong to the history of Peru. After the final effort of the Incas to recover Cusco from 1536 to 1537 had been defeated by Diego de Almagro, a dispute occurred between him and Pizarro respecting the limits of their jurisdiction. This led to battle. Almagro was defeated 1538 and executed, but his supporters conspired and assassinated Pizarro on June 26, 1541. On this day in history, July 27th, 1689, as part of the Glorious Revolution, the Battle of Killiecrankie is a victory for the Jacobites. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the pass. Killiecrankie, of Perthshire, Scotland, 3 3/4 miles north by northwest of Pitlochry by the LMS Railway. Beginning close to Killiecrankie Station, it extends southwards to the Bridge of Garry, through the narrow wooded glen in the channel of which flows the Garry. A road constructed by General Wade in 1732 runs up the pass, and between this and the river is the railway. The battle between the Jacobites, 1689, under Viscount Dundee, and the Royal Force, led by General Hugh Mackay, though named from the ravine, was not actually fought in the pass. The Highlanders were drawn up where the railway station now stands, and before Mackay had time to form his force, was swept back into the pass and lost nearly half their number. Viscount Dundee was killed near Urad House. On this day in history, July 28th, 1656, as part of the Second Northern War, the Battle of Warsaw begins. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Warsaw, capital of Poland, chief town of the province of Warsaw, area of the administration district, 46 square miles. Population from 1939, 1,289,000, of whom 70.7% were Poles, the rest nearly all Jews. It is beautifully situated in the left bank of the Vistula, 387 miles by rail east of Berlin, and 695 miles southwest of Leningrad. It stands on a terrace 120 to 130 feet above the river, to which it descends by steep slopes, leaving a broad bench at its base. The suburb of Praga, on the right bank of the Vistula, here 450 to 660 yards broad, is connected with Warsaw by two bridges. Germany occupied Warsaw in 1939. Situated in a fertile plain on a great navigable river below its confluence with the Pilica and the Vipris, which drain the southern area, and above its confluence with the Neerwinden and Bug, which tap a wide region in the east, Warsaw became in medieval times the entrepot for the trade of those fertile and populous valleys with Western Europe. Owing to its position in the territory of Mazovia, which was neither Polish nor Lithuanian, and, so to say, remained neutral between the two rival powers which constituted the unified kingdom, it became the capital of both, and secured advantages over the purely Polish Krakow and the Lithuanian Vilna. The precise date of the foundation of the town is not known, but it is supposed that Conrad, Duke of Mazovia, erected a castle on the present site of Warsaw as early as the 9th century. Casimir the Just is supposed to have fortified it in the 11th century, but Warsaw is not mentioned in the annals before 1224. Until 1526, it was the residence of the Dukes of Mazovia, but when their dynasty became extinct, it was annexed to Poland. When Poland and Lithuania were united, Warsaw was chosen as the royal residence. Sigismund Augustus, Wasa, made it 1550 the real capital of Poland, and from 1572 onwards, election of the kings of Poland took place on the field of Wola, on the western outskirts of the city. Charles Gustavus of Sweden took it in 1655 and kept it for a year. The Poles retook it in July 1656. Augustus II and Augustus III did much for its embellishment, but it had much to suffer during the war with Charles XII of Sweden, who captured it in 1702. But in the following year, peace was made, and it became free again. The disorders which followed upon the death of Augustus III in 1763 opened a field for Russian intrigue, and in 1764 the Russians took possession of the town and secured the election of Stanislaus Poniatowski, which led in 1773 to the first partition of Poland. In November 1794, the Russians took it again, after the bloody assault on Praga, but next year, in the third partition of Poland, Warsaw was given to Prussia. In November 1806, the town was occupied by the troops of Napoleon, and after the Peace of Tilsit, 1807, was made the capital of the independent Duchy of Warsaw. But the Austrians seized it on April 21, 1809, and kept possession of it till June 2nd, when it once more became independent. The Russians finally took it on February 8, 1813. On November 29, 1830, Warsaw gave the signal for the unsuccessful insurrection which lasted nearly 1 year. The city was captured after great bloodshed by Paskevich on September 7, 1831. Deportations on a large scale, executions, and confiscation of the domains of the nobility followed, and until 1856, Warsaw remained under severe military rule. In 1862, a series of demonstrations began to be made in Warsaw in favor of the independence of Poland, and after a bloody repression, a general insurrection followed in January 1863. The Russians remaining, however, masters of the situation. Executions, banishment to the convict prisons of Serbia, and confiscation of estates were carried out on an unheard-of scale. Scientific societies and high schools were closed, monasteries and nunneries were emptied. Hundreds of Russian officials were called in to fill the administrative posts, and to teach in the schools and the university. The Russian language was made obligatory in all official acts, in all legal proceedings, and even, to a great extent, in trade. The very name of Poland was expunged from official writings, and, while the old institutions were abolished, the Russian tribunals and administrative institutions were introduced. The serfs were liberated. Much rioting and lawless bloodshed took place in the city in 1905 to 06. In 1915, Warsaw fell to the Germans. In 1918, the Poles made themselves masters of the city and set up a government. On September 27, 1939, Warsaw again surrendered to German troops after a siege of 20 days and a series of bloody battles in its environs. Much of the city was reduced to ruins by air raids. The streets of Warsaw were adorned with many fine buildings, partly palaces exhibiting the Polish nobility's love of display, partly churches and cathedrals, and partly public buildings erected by the municipality or by private bodies. Fine public gardens and several monuments further embellished the city. The university was first established in 1816. It was closed in 1832 and was not reopened until 1869 as a Russian institution. It has a remarkable library of more than 500,000 volumes, rich natural history collections, a fine botanic garden, and an astronomical observatory. The medical school enjoys high repute in the scientific world. The School of Arts, the Academy of Agriculture and Forestry, and the Conservatory of Music are all high-class institutions. The Association of the Friends of Scientific and the Historical and Agricultural Societies of Warsaw were once well known, but were suppressed after the insurrections, though they are revived. The Theatre for Polish Drama and the Ballet is a fine building, which induces two theaters under the same roof. But the pride of Warsaw is its theater in the Lizinki Gardens, which were laid out 1767 to 88 in an old bed of the Vistula by King Stanislaus Poniatowski, and have beautiful shady alleys, artificial ponds, an elegant little palace with ceilings painted by Bacchiarelli, several imperial villas, and a monument 1788 to John Sobieski, King of Poland, who delivered Vienna from the Turks in 1683. Here, an artificial ruin on an island makes an open-air theater. Two other public gardens, with alleys of old chestnut trees, are situated in the center of the city. One of these, the Saski Ogrod, or Saxon Garden, 17 acres, which has a summer theater and fine old trees, is one of the most beautiful in Europe. It is the resort of the Warsaw aristocracy. The Krasinski Garden was the promenade of the Jews. The central point of the life of Warsaw is the former royal castle, Zamek Królewski, on Sigismund Square. It was built by the Dukes of Mazovia, enlarged by Sigismund III, whose memorial stands opposite, and Władysław IV, and embellished by John Sobieski and Stanislaus Poniatowski. Most of its pictures and other art treasures were removed to St. Petersburg and Moscow, but have been restored. Four main thoroughfares radiate from it. 1. The Krakowski Przemyśle, the best street in Warsaw, runs southward. It is continued by the Nowy Świat and the Ujazdowska Allee Avenue, which leads to the Lizinki streets. The Church of St. Anne, 1454, which belonged formerly to the Bernardine Monastery, the Agricultural and Industrial Museum, with an ethnographical collection, the monument, 1898, to the national poet Adam Mickiewicz, 1798 to 1855, the former Saxon Palace, once the residence of the Polish kings, the Lutheran Church, finished in 1799, one of the most conspicuous in Warsaw, the buildings of the Art Association, erected in 1898 to 1900, the University, the Church of the Holy Ghost, 1682 to 96, with the heart and monument of the musician F. Chopin, a monument, 1830, to the astronomer N. Copernic, 1473 to 1543, the palaces of the Zamoyski family, now the Conservatory of Music, the building of the Philharmonic Society, 1899 to 1901, and the Church of St. Alexander, built in 1826 and splendidly restored in 1891. The Ujazdowska Allee Avenue, planted with lime trees and bordered with cafes and places of amusement, is the Champs-Élysées of Warsaw. It leads to the Lizinki Park and to the Belvedere Palace, 1822, and farther west to the Mokotowski Parade Ground, which is surrounded on the south and west by the manufacturing district. Another principal street, the Marsaliga, runs parallel to the Ujazdowska from the Saxon Garden to this parade ground, on the southeast of which are the barracks. The above-mentioned streets are crossed by another series, running west and east, the chief of them being the Senators, which begins at Sigismund Square and contains the best shops, the Palace of the Archbishop of Warsaw, the Bank of Poland, the Town Hall, 1725, burned in 1863 but rebuilt in 1870, the small Podblaka Palace, the Theatre, 1833, the Old Mint, the beautiful Reformed Church, 1882, the Orthodox Greek Cathedral of the Trinity, rebuilt in 1837, the Krasinski Palace, 1692, burned in 1782, but rebuilt, the Church of the Transfiguration, a thank offering by John Sobieski for his victory of 1683, and containing his heart and that of Stanislaus Poniatowski, and palaces are on or near Senator Street and Miodowa Street. To the west, Senator Street is continued by Elector Street, where is the very elegant church, 1849, of St. Charles Borromeo, and the Kladna Street, leading to the suburb of Wola, with a large field where the kings of Poland used to be erected. In Lesno Street, which branches off from Senator Street, are the Zalazna Brama, or Iron Gate, in the marketplace, the bazaar, the arsenal, and the Velopolski barracks. To the north of Sigismund Square is the old town, Stermiasto, the Jewish quarter, and farther north still the citadel. The old town very much recalls old Germany by its narrow streets and antique buildings, the Cathedral of St. John, the most ancient church in Warsaw, having been built in the 13th century and restored in the 17th. The cathedral, erected in 1832 to 1835 as a punishment for the insurrection of 1831, is of an antiquated type. The suburb of Praga, on the right bank of the Vistula, is poorly built and often flooded, but the bloody assaults which led to its capture in 1794 by the Russians under Suvorov and in 1831 by Paskevich give it a name in history. In the outskirts of Warsaw are various more or less noteworthy villas, palaces, and battlefields. Wilanow, the palace of John Sobieski, afterwards belonging to Count X. Branicki, was partly built in 1678 to 1694 by Turkish prisoners in a fine Italian style, and is now renowned for its historical relics, portraits, and pictures. It is situated to the south of Warsaw, together with the pretty pilgrimage church of Czerniakow, built by Prince Stanislaw Lubomirski in 1691, and many other fine villas, Morisynik, Natolin, Krolikornia, which also has a picture gallery, Wierzbno, and Mokotow. Marymont, an old country residence of the wife of John Sobieski, and the Cascada, much visited by the inhabitants of Warsaw, in the north, the Saska Kempa, on the right bank of the Vistula, and the castle of Joblana, down the Vistula, are among others that deserve mention. The castle and fortress of Belani, 4.5 miles north, on the bank of the Vistula, are a popular holiday resort in the spring. Among the battlefields in the neighborhood is that of Grokow, where the Polish troops were defeated in 1831, and Wawar, in the same district, east of Praga, where Prince John Poniatowski defeated the Austrians in the War of 1809. At Myśliosi, 50 miles up the Vistula, Kosciuszko was wounded and taken by the Russians in 1794, and the whole east bank of the Vistula was the scene of the great Polish victory over the Soviet armies in 1920. Warsaw is connected by 6 trunk lines with Vienna, Kiev, and southwestern Russia, Moscow, Leningrad, Danzig, and Berlin. The steel industry has developed, and the manufactures of plated silver, carriages, boots, and shoes, annual turnover, £8,457,000. Millinery, hosiery, gloves, tobacco, sugar, and house decorations are of importance, chiefly owing to the skill of the workers. The city has a trade in corn, leather, and coal. The deportations of Warsaw artisans checked industrial progress. The population, nevertheless, grew rapidly from 161,008 in 1860, 276,000 in 1872, and 436,759 in 1887, to 756,426 in 1901. Its growth in the period between 1918 and 1939, when World War II broke out, was remarkable. Warsaw is the seat of a Roman Catholic archbishopric and of the Orthodox Metropolitan. On this day in history, July 29th, 1693, as part of the War of the Grand Alliance, the Battle of Landen occurs, in which France wins a victory over Allied forces in the Netherlands. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Neerwinden and Marsaliga. Thus Luxembourg obtained his last and greatest opportunity. He was still superior in numbers, but William at Louvain had the advantage of position. The former, given more latitude by his master this year, threatened Liege, drew William over to its defense, and then advanced to attack him. The allies, however, retired to a strongly entrenched position around Neerwinden, in which they were attacked by Luxembourg on July 29th. The long and doubtful battle ended in a brilliant victory for Luxembourg, but his exhausted army could not pursue far. William was as unshaken and determined as ever, and the campaign closed not with a treaty of peace, but with a few maneuvers which, by inducing William to believe in an attack on Ath, enabled Luxembourg to besiege and capture Charleroi. October. Neerwinden was not the only French victory of the year. Catinat, advancing to the relief of Pine-Rollo, which the Duke of Savoy was besieging, took up a position north of the village of Marsaliga. Here on October 4th, the Duke of Savoy attacked him front to front, but the greatly superior regimental efficiency of the French, and Catinat's minute attention to details in arraying them, gave the newly created marshal a victory that was a not unworthy pendant to Neerwinden. The Piedmontese and their allies lost, it is said, 10,000 killed, wounded, and prisoners, as against Catinat's 1,800. But here, too, the results were trifling, and this year of victory is remembered chiefly as the year in which people perished of want to the accompaniment of Te Deums. In 1694, late in the season, owing to the prevailing distress and famine, Louis opened a fresh campaign in the Netherlands. The armies were larger and more ineffective than ever, and William offered no further opportunities to his formidable opponent. In September, after inducing William to desist from his intention of besieging Dunkirk by appearing on his flank with a mass of cavalry, which had ridden from Meuse 100 miles in 4 days, Luxembourg gave up his command. He died on January 4th, and with him in tradition of the Caen school of warfare disappeared from Europe. In Catalonia, de Noailles gained some success. In 1695, William found Marshal Villeroy a far less formidable opponent than Luxembourg had been, and easily succeeded in keeping him in Flanders while a corps of the allies invested Namur. Cohorn directed the siege works, and, as in 1692, but with sides reversed, the defenders were progressively dislodged, the citadel itself being stormed by the British Grenadiers, as the song commemorates, on August 30th. By 1696, necessity had compelled Louis to renounce his vague and indefinite offensive policy, and he now frankly restricted his efforts to the maintenance of what he had won in the preceding campaigns. In this new policy, he met with much success. His marshals held their various spheres of operations without allowing the Allies to inflict any material injury, and also preserved French soil from the burden of their own maintenance. In this, as before, they were powerfully assisted by the disunion and divided counsels of their heterogeneous enemies. In Piedmont, Catinat crowned his work by making peace and alliance with the Duke of Savoy. The last campaign was in 1697. Catinat and Vauban besieged Ath. This siege was perhaps the most regular and methodical of the great engineer's career. It lasted 23 days and cost the assailants only 50 men. King William did not stir from his entrenched position at Brussels. Lastly, in August 1697, Vendôme, Noailles' successor, captured Barcelona. The Peace of Ryswick, signed on October 30th, closed the war by practically restoring the status quo ante. But neither the ambitions of Louis nor the Grand Alliance that opposed them ceased to have force, and 3 years later the struggle began anew. On this day in history, July 30th, 1619, in Jamestown, Virginia, the first colonial European Representative Assembly in the Americas, the Virginia General Assembly, convenes for the first time. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over Virginia's struggles for self-government. At the beginning, Virginia colonists had held their land and improvements in common, but in 1616 the land was parceled out, and the settlers were scattered along the banks of the James and Appomattox rivers many miles inland. The rapid expansion of tobacco culture soon made the community self-supporting. The year 1619 that saw the first Negroes brought in also saw the first representative assembly in North America, the Virginia House of Burgesses, a meeting of planters sent from the plantations to assist the governor and council in reforming and remaking the laws of the colony. In 1621, a constitution was granted whereby the London Company appointed the governor and a council, and the people were to choose annually from their counties, towns, hundreds, and plantation delegates to the House of Burgesses. The popular branch, like the English House of Commons, granted supplies and originated laws, and the governor and council enjoyed the right of revision and veto, as did the king and the House of Lords at home. Later, the council also originated bills. The council sat also as a Supreme Court to review the county courts and had, in important cases, original jurisdiction. The system remained unchanged throughout the colonial period, but in 1624 the king took the place and exercised the authority of the London Company. On March 22, 1622, the Indians fell upon the whites and slew 350 persons. Sickness and famine once again visited the colony, and the population was reduced by nearly one half. These losses were repaired, however. The tobacco industry grew in importance, and the settlers built their cabins far in the interior of lowland Virginia. This rapid growth was scarcely retarded by a second Indian attack in April 1644, which resulted in the death of several hundred settlers. By 1648, the population was 15,000. In her attitude toward the war in England between King Charles and Parliament, Virginia sympathized with the king. However, though Sir William Berkeley, who had been governor since 1641, was absolutely loyal to the crown, it was considered the part of wisdom to surrender to a fleet sent over by Parliament in 1652 after a slight show of resistance. But substantial acknowledgments were made by the parliamentary commissioners of Virginia's rights. Richard Bennet, a Puritan, now ruled the province. He and his Puritan successors, Edward Digges and Samuel Matthews, made no serious change in the administration of the colony. The return of Berkeley, who was restored to power in 1616, was the beginning of a reaction which concentrated authority in the hands of the older families and thus created a privileged class. The governor, supported by the privileged families, retained the same House of Burgesses for 16 years, lest a new one might not be submissive. The increasing mass of the population who dwelt along the western border and on the less fertile ridges developed a feeling of hostility towards the oligarchy. They desired a freer land grant system, protection against the inroads of the Indians along the border, and frequent sessions of an assembly to be chosen by all the freeholders. In 1676, the Indians again attacked the border farmers, but the governor had refused assistance. Being willing, it was charged, that the border populations should suffer while he and his adherents enjoyed a lucrative fur trade with the Indians. Under these circumstances, Nathaniel Bacon, 1647-76, took up the cause of the borderers and severely punished the Indians at the Battle of Bloody Run. Berkeley, meanwhile, had outlawed Bacon, whose forces now marched on the capital demanding recognition as the authorized army of defense. This was refused and civil war began, in which the governor was defeated and Jamestown was burned. But Bacon fell a victim to malaria and died in October in Gloucester County. Berkeley closed the conflict with wholesale executions and confiscations. Censured by the king, he sailed to England to make his defense, but died in London in 1677 without having seen Charles. Until the accession of William and Mary, there was continued unrest in Virginia and a bitter struggle between the popular party in Virginia and the English government seeking to reduce the privileges of the House of Burgesses. In many respects, the government came off victorious, but the House retained that all-important power of levying taxes. In 1689, James Blair was made commissary in Virginia of the Bishop of London and throughout a long life did valiant service for the colony. In 1693, he obtained the charter for William and Mary College and became its first president. It was founded at Williamsburg, which in 1699 was made the capital. On this day in history, July 31st, 1653, Thomas Dudley, English soldier and politician, 3rd Governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, dies. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the governor and featuring narration from my friend Osword.
Thomas Dudley, born 1576, died 1653, a British colonial governor of Massachusetts, was born in Northampton, England in 1576, possibly a member of the elder branch of the family to which Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, belonged. He was the son of a country gentleman of some means and high standing, was the captain of an English company in the French expedition of 1597, serving under Henry of Navarre, and eventually became the steward of the Earl of Lincoln's estate, which he managed with great success for many years. Having been converted to Puritanism, he became an advocate of its strictest tenets. In about 1627, he associated himself with other Lincolnshire gentlemen, who in 1629 entered into an agreement to settle New England, provided that they were allowed to take the charter with them. They presented their plans to the General Court of the Plymouth Company, and they agreed. And in April 1830, Dudley sailed to America in the same ship with John Winthrop, the newly appointed governor, Dudley himself at the last moment being chosen deputy governor in place of John Humphrey, the Earl of Lincoln's son-in-law, whose departure was delayed. Dudley was, for many years, the most influential man in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, save Winthrop, with whose policy he often opposed than agreed with. He was deputy governor in 1629 through 34, in 1637 through 40, in 1646 through 50, and in 1651 through 53, and was governor 4 times. He served as governor in 1634, 1640, 1645, and 1650. Soon after his arrival in the colony, he settled at Newton, which is now known as Cambridge, of which he was one of the founders. He was also one of the earliest promoters of the plan for the establishment of Harvard College. Winthrop's decision to make Boston the capital instead of Newton precipitated the first of many quarrels between the two. Dudley's sterner and harsher Puritanism being in strong contrast with Winthrop's more tolerant and liberal views. He was an earnest and persistent heresy hunter, not only of the antinomians, but even such a good Puritan as John Carton, against whom he brought charges, feeling the weight of his stern and remorseless hand. His position he himself best expressed in the following brief verse found amongst his papers. Let men of God in courts and churches watch o'er such as a Tolarian hatch, lest that will egg bring forth a cockatrice, to poison all with heresy and vice. He died at Roxbury, Massachusetts on July 31st, 1653.